I'm going to try to get you up to speed on some recent findings in this research community. The first question, is why should we think about violence? I think some of the reasons are relatively obvious. There's a large number of deaths around the world related to violence, including interpersonal violence, intergroup violence, as well as self-harm, which I'll discuss briefly. There's also a tremendous number of non-lethal impacts, such as sort of the enduring psychological cost of being exposed to violence, and it has a tremendous amount of impact on economic performance, political institutions, people's general well-being, and population displacement. So one thing that's been done in recent years is to realize that we can apply quasi-experimental techniques to understand patterns of violence and how they respond to climatic variations. And so I won't go into a great deal, but the basic idea is to follow populations over time and observe how they respond to changes in their local environmental conditions. What we don't do in this strand of research is compare populations across space. So we do not look at Norway and Nigeria and attribute differences in violence levels in Nigeria to the fact that Nigeria is a warmer or wetter location. What we do instead is we look at a place like Nigeria, follow them over time, and observe how that unchanging population responds to changes in their environment. So to give you an example, so first, this has been a classic question for quite some time. Many people have observed that throughout human history, fluctuations in the climate are associated with periods of political instability and institutional collapse. These are just a few examples we collected in a 2013 science paper. But what we're doing nowadays is looking for systematic modern evidence in the modern world. And so to do that, I'll show you one example where we did it looking at the El Niño Southern Oscillation. To understand sort of what is the effect of this global climatic pattern, we first had to characterize what a standard sort of El Niño-like event looked like. And when El Niño occurs, the Central Pacific releases a tremendous amount of thermal energy into the atmosphere that propagates around the tropics in an equatorial wave, leading to warming and drying throughout the tropics, which lasts for a period of about a year and then dissipates after the event. So what we did in this study is we characterized those locations that basically got hit by that large equatorial wave, had large amounts of warming. Those are the red regions here, denoted teleconnected regions, whereas the regions further in the north and the south are the blue regions. Those are the weakly affected regions because those places are not as strongly affected by El Niño. And what we see is when we look at the probability that a randomly selected country in that teleconnected region exhibits a new civil war, we see that the probability is strongly predicted by the state of the East Pacific. And so in the cooler and wetter La Niña state on the left, you see the rate of new civil conflict generation is about 2% per year, whereas as you shift to the hotter and drier El Niño state, the rate of conflicts doubles to 6%. Now, if you look at the northern and southern regions basically as a placebo test, because those are the populations not affected by these events, the new conflict in those regions stay sort of uniformly at 2% per year. Okay? Now, in reviewing a large body of literature similar to this, so those results I just showed you are on the right, but we've collected a lot of studies from elsewhere around the world, and we realized that we actually have sort of nested studies, different researchers looking at different populations. And across all of these different spatial scales and scales of social organization, we see relatively similar patterns where hotter and drier conditions tend to be associated with higher rates of violence. So what we did in an earlier paper, in which we've now updated in a forthcoming paper, is to conduct a large-scale meta-analysis where we collected these studies from throughout the literature, standardized their results into comparable units, and asked whether there is a common component in the way that societies around the world respond to changes in climatic conditions. So what I'm showing you here are the percent change in the rate of interpersonal violence across a variety of contexts and studies for each one standard deviation change in either temperature or rainfall measure. And the two different measures are here indicated by the color of the marker. And so what you see, and on the right, the very far right, is a distribution showing the Bayesian, the posterior distribution of estimates one might expect to see if you did a new study. So by sort of the median, or the average estimate is around between 2 and 3% per standard deviation, looking only at interpersonal violence. And then when we look at a much larger literature on intergroup violence, we see greater dispersion across studies, as well as greater amounts of statistical uncertainty within a study, and that has to do with the fact that these studies have much smaller samples. We have many fewer country years we can study than we do have interactions on the street in US counties. And so on the right you see the posterior again, and one of the notable take-homes is that the average effects here are about an order of magnitude more. Okay, so we're talking about now about a 10 or 11% change in rates of new conflict for each 1 standard deviation in temperature or rainfall. Now, one criticism of this research was that, it might be the fact that rainfall and temperature respond differently. So in our new analysis, we've actually rerun many, many studies from prior researchers, and we point out the effects of temperature that are both contemporaneous as well as lag temperature are very different. Okay, so the current effect of temperature seems to be large and rapid, whereas for rainfall, we see both sort of a smaller, less significant, but we see a more persistent effect between current rainfall and historical rainfall. A very similar pattern holds when we look at interpersonal conflict. You see a really rapid, strong response to temperature and a much smaller and sort of less influential response to rainfall. Now, those results led us to ask a different question. There's a tremendous amount of similarity between the structure and timing of the interpersonal and intergroup response, so intergroup conflict. So we wanted to ask whether or not there is any sort of common mechanism between the two. So we went to Mexico, where we've been able to collect data on both interpersonal and intergroup violence in the same institutional and social context, and ask what might be a mechanism that's playing an important role in the intergroup violence. Now, most researchers in this community have to date focused heavily on economic issues, inequality issues, the notion that when the climate changes, it changes the incentives to engage in different types of violence. But what we did here was we wanted to know whether or not this idea of the environment affecting people's cognitive processes or willingness to apply aggression in different types of situations could be playing a role in intergroup violence. If you're unfamiliar with this idea, I'm just going to motivate it with one quote from a psychologist. This study would not get past IRB now, but in 1967, Rolls published this statement that they basically put people in a hot room, and they said, all of our subjects, when these people were subjected to high temperatures in groups of 48, there was continual arguing, needling, agitating, jibing, fist-fighting, threatening, and even an attempted knifing. At lower temperatures or in small groups, this behavior diminished. Okay? However, when graduate students were similarly tested later in the fall, there was no aggressive behavior, even on the highest temperature. Okay, so if nothing else, this is some motivation. Our much more serious question is, do these similar patterns that have been replicated in multiple laboratory studies, do these psychological effects of temperature play any role whatsoever in larger and potentially more important intergroup conflicts? So to do that, we collected, can we go back? Just one? Okay, so what I'm showing you here are results where we are looking at the effect of drug trafficking organization-related killings. So this is basically gang violence among the extremely violent organizations in Mexico, the effect of sort of, quote, normal homicides unrelated to drug trafficking, and now new results on the far right. These are the effect of hot months on suicide rates throughout regions of Mexico. And so what we see is sort of both a relatively linear and consistent pattern across Mexico. These are the effects across space, and the takeaway is that it's not one location that's dominating. In reality, whatever mechanism is at play is something that we see sort of pervasively across society. And different patterns, for example, the speed with which the effect shows up. So these are effects ordered by month of changes in temperature and their effect on violence in period 0. And so what we see is in drug trafficking organizations, there's a very rapid and sort of precise response. Similarly, when we look at just normal homicides, we see the same response. And again, when we look at just suicides, we see a very rapid and sort of response that at the moment that the environment changes. We do a variety of other tests in the paper to understand whether or not some economic pathway might be playing a role. I won't show them all to you here, but here is sort of what I think is one of the more clever tests. We look at the same drug trafficking organizations committing different types of crimes that are more clearly economically motivated. So in the last 3 columns, these are the effects of temperature on car theft, extortions, and kidnappings. These are clearly economically motivated. And what we see is that there's this large effect on killings, but no clear effect on these economically motivated crimes. Okay? And so to us, this suggests that perhaps this tendency towards violent behavior induced by a psychological mechanism might be, that we think is definitely playing a role in sort of normal homicides, might be playing a role in these intergroup conflicts. Okay? So conclusions from this sort of very new line of research is that we see, consistent with prior findings, a very strong link. Economic factors look like they might be playing a role, but they seem unable to explain all the patterns that we observe in the data. which then sort of suggests to us that perhaps these psychological mechanisms could be playing a contributing role. Now, in the last few minutes, I want to also point out how these types of empirical results are now being applied to various decision-making policies. In the American Climate Prospectus, which I was lucky enough to participate in, we modeled the projected impact of crime rates across the United States. So to do that, we constructed optimal composite estimates for the response of different types of crime to different types of temperatures. So on the left, you see the effect of temperature on property crime, and essentially property crime increases up to a point and then levels off. And what we think this is not so much that high temperatures promote crime, but that low temperatures suppress crime, right? It's very difficult to steal a car that's buried under snow. But on the right-hand side, you see that violent crime, consistent with many other patterns around the world, increases essentially linearly with temperature, okay? And this is explained by the psychologists as perhaps something related to human psychology. So we take these optimal composites and we apply basically a series of models that allow us to reconstruct sort of the probability distribution that individual counties will be exposed to specific sequences of days under all possible states in a manner that is consistent with the prior probability distribution of the global climate sensitivity, okay? And we have a sort of a sophisticated approach that allows us to account both for model uncertainty as well as sort of natural variability, as well as statistical uncertainty in the parameter estimates that I was showing you earlier, okay? And once we do that, that allows us to generate sort of a fully probabilistic projection where each county has its own probability distribution of outcomes conditional on a specific RCP scenario. So what I'm showing you here on the right are changes over time as we move into the near future to mid-century and late century of the probability distribution for changes in violent crime rates associated with warming scenarios, okay? And so you see there's a full probabilistic projection with a median and some levels of certainty. We see that as we move to the future, we have general increase in violent crime rates projected, as well as an increase in the variance, okay? And that arises from uncertainty primarily over what the global climate will do at specific locations. On the left-hand side, I'm just showing median projections for each county. So you see the spatial distribution. This is not true for all type of economic impact that we study, but for crime, because the response is essentially linear, you develop a relatively uniform national response because locations throughout the United States tend to warm relatively uniformly. There's not tremendous benefit here from starting out as a cold county versus starting out as a warm county. Finally, in my last 2 minutes, if you've heard about this research, there's some chance you might have heard about it through the media. It's a very controversial research area, and it's received many very public criticisms. And so I just want to address a few of them here, but I've addressed many of them throughout many different types of analyses. So one criticism is that there's sort of a selection bias problem when we look at large numbers of studies. Now, in the original analysis, we do a very formal analysis of whether or not there is publication bias, and I assure you there is some evidence of publication bias. But it is always impossible to know all of the studies that were not published. And so in response to a critique in climatic change, my co-authors and I did this thought experiment where we replicated our original results, but we imagined that there are a large number of omitted studies that we forgot about, and so to sort of proxy for those omitted studies, we take the one study that's most out of line with our main finding. And we just keep adding in new versions of that fake study to see at what point do our results disappear, okay? And what we find is that essentially there had to have been 80 such studies that completely disagreed with our main finding before it is the case that our original result was generated completely by selection, okay? Now, given that there were only 20 studies in the original analysis, that suggests to us we would have to sort of be missing 70% of the literature, which we find sort of implausible, okay? There's another criticism of this research is that we look sort of in following populations over time, we're looking at how people are responding to short-term changes in their environment rather than long-term changes. And so what we do instead is we can look at how cross-sectional patterns and trends in violence relate to local temperature changes in violence. And what we find is that the effect of trends seems to be almost identical to the effect of these short-term variations. The very last thing, which I'll leave up here at the end, is that people have said, we've seen rising temperatures, but we've seen no effect in violence. This is the data set assembled by the individual who made that critique. Essentially, that statement is both, that statement's just simply not true. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Solomon. Okay, actually, I was going to give you time for one quick question if you want, Solomon, but I think anybody?
Nobody else wants to ask questions. Solomon, can you talk a little bit about those graphs you use with the uncertainty?
John is referring to these, those are graphs. I can't show you now because I don't know how to graph, but we've developed a technique for showing the full sort of probability distribution of the non-parametric regression coefficients. We call those watercolor regressions, and if you just Google that, you'll find a very clear explanation and some code to